Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. And also, don't forget to comment after the video's up so I can get some community engagement and see where people like, what they like, and what they would like to see more of. And just thoughts and opinions. And in the live chat, of course, anybody that does a super chat will be given first treatment for comments and to our show tonight. So as a brief little introduction before I get into it, I've been thinking a lot about how the word equality is used, both by the right and the left. And I think there's a lot of problems with the way it's used. It had an earlier use and an earlier understanding that I think is helpful and makes it more helpful in our current situation where there's a lot of confusion around what that means. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a presentation that I prepared where I discuss what I think equality actually means and where both the right and the left get wrong, hence the title, The Political Horseshoe of Equality. So without further ado, I shall begin reading the presentation. As happens in so many cases, a sort of inverted horseshoe theory develops around the right's reaction to the left. Sargon of Akkad popularized the notion of the horseshoe theory by saying that right and left-wing authoritarians had more in common because they were authoritarian. Critics claimed he ignored the multi-layered differences between various left and right-wing political regimes. For the purposes of this discussion, I am talking about an inverted political horseshoe. The idea is whatever the left doesn't like is good, without any further investigation into how bad it may or may not be in practice. Equality, or should I say inequality, is seen as good because the left dislikes it. The problem with this is not only does the left have an unclear and arguably defective view of equality, the right reflexively looks at this and negates it. I want to add clarity to this discussion and point out how a reflexive rejection of the idea of equality is problematic. The left originally had a view of inequality that was rooted in a critique of capitalism and the centralized concentration of wealth. In brief, the capitalists exploited the working class by extracting the surplus value of the worker. The capitalist sells the produced good for more than it costs to produce, and that surplus is profit and does not come back to the worker. Couple this with vast amounts of wealth and property concentrated in a few hands, protected through a complex web of privileges based on law and custom, and we see that certain individuals who sit at the heads of these systems have far more power than the average worker or conglomeration of workers. These men have an outsized impact on the nation based on their actions. This inequality can be measured by looking at the difference between the highest paid CEO and the lowest paid worker. As someone who has studied and read socialist, anarchist, and Marxist literature my entire life, the strongest case to be made in favor of their cause is the moral argument they produce based on this description and critique of the capitalist system and the inequalities it produces. It is rooted in and an extension of an older critique of inequality that is rooted in a classical source such as Aristotle, who warned that the idle, rich, and poor would pinch the middle class, often working hand in hand, as Spengler points out. Or if we look at American history itself, the idea that if a political tyrant leans on his people, and the little guy, patriots will rise up and chastise the tyrant. This critique, which has its origin in a criticism of tyranny from the state, is being repurposed to look at tyranny coming from the corporate world. In its political and economic form, this kind of inequality is synthetic and constructed. It is synthetic as it is not the product of nature or natural phenomena, and is constructed in that men act in a systematic fashion to make this reality come to be. At this juncture, we see where the inverted horseshoe begins to develop. When it comes to hierarchies, we can divide them into two kinds, natural and synthetic. Natural hierarchies are those that originate autonomously in nature without any direct human operation, and or those that originate as the direct outgrowth of human biology. If we look at the food chain in an ecosystem, we see a naturally occurring hierarchy with apex predators at the top and plants or whatever forms the basis of the food chain. For example, in the deep ocean, chemicals out of vents. Or rather, I should say bacteria that can synthesize the chemicals into energy at the bottom. All of this occurs totally independently of human activity. The second form of natural hierarchies are those that are born out of direct human action, from the necessity of maintaining biological human life. Insofar as man is an animal, and he builds systems to meet the needs of maintaining his biological functions, he is acting naturally. Therefore, forming families with the hierarchy of fathers over children and husbands over wives is natural, because it is the necessary outgrowth of meeting man's social, reproductive, and pre-political needs. We can go further and argue that political and religious institutions, as well as family ones, are organic, and that for the provision of the rest of man's needs, they can only be provided by such a behavior. Think of it as a complex eusocial behavior. Outside of mankind, eusocial behavior is found primarily with insects, such as ants or termites. To further refine our definition of natural hierarchies, let us say that in addition to naturally occurring phenomena, we can speak of all the forms of man's activities that form out of his eusocial behavior, including but not limited to family formation, political and religious institutions. Non-natural hierarchies of necessity must needs develop out of human action. This occurs when the natural development of eusocial processes becomes cancerous and grows without limit or purpose. We can see in the forms of late-stage capitalism, totalitarian states, and vast technocratic networks this form of cancerous growth. They are synthetic in that they are not only built in for some end not directly tied to meeting man's needs, but those that are antithetical to those needs. The toxic wasteland produced by techno-capital or Soviet-style communism is so obvious as to need no further commentary. Capitalism was sold as the rational economic system based on the morality of self-interest, cultivating self-interest to maximize our productive powers in order to meet human physical needs. With this bait, we got here. Having demarcated natural and unnatural hierarchies, we see the error of the left over the last 2 centuries. They have clumsily conflated the two. This can best be seen by looking at any number of woke progressive essays about fatherhood and Father's Day being fascist concepts. It is clear that there is a world of difference between natural and unnatural hierarchies. The power of a Roman paterfamilias might be absolute in a very limited sense, but even this is checked by law and custom. To compare this to the power of a dictator, as the left does, is to show a total failure in comprehension. One cannot destroy natural hierarchies in man, those hierarchies that are born out of his innate eusociality, for the purpose of meeting his biological needs without killing man as an organism. One can alter capitalism, the state, and technocracy, or even replace them outright without destroying man as a biological organism. The leftist Grug says, "Me see difference in measurement, therefore inequality bad." No further comment is needed. This inverted horseshoe was a massive leveling device that shattered the social framework of the US. A perfectly executed psyop. Yet, if it was factually false, as it is, how is this conflation so effective? That I can answer in 2 words. The cash nexus. This might need some unpacking. The typical feminista would complain that men, a projection of her father, serve the patriarchy. For her, the Marxist critique of capitalism is identical with the patriarchy. It doesn't matter that Marx never said that. Her father and the other men in her life might say this is nonsense and give several very cogent arguments in favor of this thesis. One problem, though, that's not really the point. Because we live in the cash nexus, the most important people in a man's life are those economic actors who employ him so he can keep the standard of living to which he is accustomed. He learns how to argue in the marketplace to improve his odds of maximizing the gain he can make, whilst minimizing his liability, the LLC man. As he is acting in a marketplace, he is motivated by and acting upon the demands of the market, of money, and his own personal desire for gain. Let us say he gets good enough at this to feel confident in his skills in navigating the marketplace and getting what he wants. Confident enough to apply these techniques at home with his wife and daughter. He feels this will level the playing field as his own emotional intelligence is not that great, and he has recently been losing ground to the women in his life. Several things happen. His wife and daughter are immediately suspicious and see that he is acting differently. He claims he is not. They know he is, but can't figure it out. He makes some early gains, but increasingly isolates his girls. They ask if it is about money, and he says it isn't, even though he's acting like he is still in the marketplace. Then his little feminista pride and joy finds feminist critical theory at school or online, and then that is all she wrote. The middle-class men who live for their work have this bad habit of mooning everybody. We all know it's about the money. It's an open secret, but they're playing pretend that it isn't. Well, until the left runs the script apt get install F everything up. To recreate hierarchies that are born out of natural phenomena or the human animal in order to meet biological needs are not unnatural by definition. In Bakunin's What is Authority, we find one of the more sophisticated leftist distinctions between natural and unnatural authority. Yes, we are absolutely the slaves of these laws, but in such slavery there is no humiliation, or rather, it is not a slavery at all. For slavery supposes an external master, a legislator outside him whom he commands. While these laws are not outside of us, they are inherent in us. They constitute our being, our whole being, physically, intellectually, and morally. We live, we breathe, we act, we think, we wish only through these laws. Without them, we are nothing. We are not. Whence then can we derive the power and wish to rebel against them? Bakunin, when he is speaking of laws in this context, is speaking about natural laws. He contrasts this with laws imposed by external human forces, which, as an anarchist, he views as illegitimate. The problem here is twofold. Like most leftists, Bakunin is bad at metaphysics, and he arbitrarily places man's social order as something outside of nature. Bakunin was an atheist and a materialist. Therefore, all that exists is matter, and all is predetermined by the laws of physics. So, in a sense, no authority is unnatural slavery, since all human existence is governed by these laws. That being said, the error is that most relevant to us here is placing various aspects of the human social order outside of the biological needs of man. For example, religion and family are themselves natural byproducts of the human animal as such, as building dams is to beavers or soaring majestically is for an eagle. Abolishing either, which was the original anarchist goal, is anti-nature. In fact, it is statist. In his infancy, man must be attended to by adults, as he is helpless and, unlike other animals, cannot grow up and develop on his own in a solitary fashion. The formation of families or religion should be seen as unnatural as a problem itself. Also, the strength of the male over the female in any animal species, such as the great apes or big cats, does not arouse the ire of leftists, but why does it with humans? This is a classic example of speciesism. They are often fond of invoking this objection to the special view man has held in Western thought. But if you are trying to remove this privileged position that man holds, man is just a clever great ape. And if chimps or gorillas have the male in the species dominate the females through their strength and no problem arises, it also follows that in the human case, if this is true as well. That the left does not believe this shows us the vacuity of their ideas. From the right, this confusion on equality hides the fact that totalitarian states, NGOs, and megacorporations, among others, while being hierarchical, are not natural hierarchies, as seen in nature with the food chain or in natural formation of social systems necessary to meet man's needs. That this is so is seen from the fact that none of these things existed before the Industrial Revolution. These potentially cancerous hierarchies consume and eat up the lower natural ones. The reflexive right-wing acceptance of all hierarchies to trigger the libs only puts at risk the natural hierarchies already strained. The classic example of this is seen in the old-school liberals' rhetoric about capitalist exploitation of the worker in Golden Age Hollywood films. Men in government or business who exert such force that they can destroy the preconditions for which these natural hierarchies form are exposed and shown to be dangerous. For example, in the 1936 classic, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, where a major subplot is the plight of disposed farmers during the Great Depression, and how a naive, wealthy benefactor is charged with insanity by members of the financial elite to divest him of his money in an attempt to prevent him from helping the farmers, we see this dynamic on full display. These forces, when left unchecked, will destroy the preconditions for the natural hierarchies that right-wing people want. For example, the circular firing squad that the manosphere types bemoan is the result of capitalism, where competition for economic goods leads to competition over women. In the older form of a bloody tyrant, we see the same problem. The classic example is the ravishing of Lucretia by Tarquin the Proud, king of Rome. As Rome's last king, he represented a force greater than any one man, the power of the state. Because he could bend the state to his will, he believed he could act with impunity. And in this story provided by Livy, we see how the state can directly interfere with and directly attack the institution of the family. The 13 colonies were formed by Englishmen seeking freedom to practice their religion as they saw fit, without the interference of the state. Whether it is the Protestant Americans complaining about their co-religionists being persecuted in Catholic states, or Catholic Americans complaining about their co-religionists being persecuted by Protestant states, both have felt the bite of the state on their form of worship. Equality is not just a set of relations pertaining to hierarchies, but also shared experience. In Sparta, the elite Spartite warriors were called the homoioi, which means equals. One key aspect of this equality was their shared training and experiences. Each member of the homoioi passed through the difficult training of the agoge and were able to shoulder their burden of duty on the battlefield. These men were equal in that they had endured the same hardships, being trained in the same fashion, and shared the same experiences. Along with this was the idea of material equality, which Sparta enforced by state decree. In addition to a sense of material and political equality, these men shared the same life experiences. This equality of experience is in part a necessity for political equality. Turning to equality under the law, we can discuss the idea that regardless of birth, rank, or status in any given legal system, that man is not unduly prejudiced against in court. The equality here is not one of status, birth, or value, but of rights. As justice is blind, one should not consider the rank of the party in either case. In Leviticus 19:15, we see a classic formulation of this principle. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. That is theft, whether a rich man steals from a poor man or a poor man steals from a rich man. The class position of either should have no bearing on the case. This is another form of equality in the bedrock of Western jurisprudence. So in this case, we can speak of equality under the law. Nobody is exempt from punishment for breaking the law. Such legal equality is also essential for military discipline. Here is reproduced an excerpt from Jan Žižka's 1423 Regulations of War, 10th paragraph. And I quote, "Be it further known that to you that should anyone steal away, walk, ride, or drive away from the army while we are on the march or encamped without the knowledge of the elders who are mentioned above, and without having the right watchword, then he, whether he be a prince or a noble or a knight or a squire or a citizen or a craftsman or a peasant or of whatever condition, shall, when arrested, be as a faithless thief who slinks away from God's battle and the army of the faithful, punished publicly by the loss of his life and goods." As can be seen throughout history, when military discipline is undermined by unequal enforcement of the law, morale flags. Order breaks down, and the combat effectiveness of the army fails. Such lawless behavior, which Žižka sought to curtail, can be seen in the looting of Spanish and Russian villages by French soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars, in both cases sparking fierce popular resistance. Famously, Wellington had similarly strict orders placed on his men when he began his French campaign in 1814, fearing a similar reaction from the French people to any English depredations. When a popular uprising occurs due to the outrages by an occupying force, it matters little if the offender comes from only a small portion of the army. Either way, it sparks universal unrest. To summarize all the points, the inverted horseshoe of equality is when the right reflexively takes the leftist view of equality at face value and accepts the obverse. Equality comes in two kinds, broadly natural and unnatural. The natural inequality is the result of natural processes such as the food chain or the innate capacities found in human biology for the formation of social institutions to meet man's biological needs, such as political, religious, and family life. Totalitarian states, NGOs, and corporations can be seen as synthetic organizations that, when left unmoored, becomes cancerous and consume the material from which they spring. The fallacy of the left is to view the unnatural hierarchies as springing from natural hierarchies and essentially the same as them, and rejecting all hierarchy as a result. The right makes the opposite error and accepts all of these hierarchies uncritically. This is the horseshoe. We can also speak of equality in terms of experience and law. The homoioi shared the same education and training, and in Western jurisprudence, theft is theft regardless of wealth or class distinction. With this, I hope to bring attention to the nuanced nature of equality and push back against both extremes to find the sensible center. All right. Middleton Walker reposted the stream. Holy cow, guys. 234 views? Is that really the case? Wow. That is just wow. That's amazing. So that's the main presented part. There's a few other things that I think would be worth getting into. We can talk about Ebel Bax, who's a Marxist, in The Fraud of Feminism, speaks of this totalitarian aspect of feminism, where the idea that the state can just completely crush anybody that stands in his way, which again, this is an outsized influence for whoever controls the lever, whether it's the corporation or the state. So I'm going to be reading from chapter 5 of The Chivalry Fake. And what's interesting here is Ebel Bax, a British Marxist, was the original red pill guy, which is kind of interesting. All right, where do we want to start? I'll start here. It seems that it would seem then that the definition of the term under consideration, based on the notion of difference to mere weakness as such, will hardly hold water, since in its application, the question of sex always takes precedent of that of weakness. Let us try again. Abandoning the moment, the definition of chivalry is a consideration for weakness, considered absolutely as we may term it. Let us see whether the definition of consideration for reflexive defenselessness in a given situation will coincide with the current usage of the word. But here again, we are met with the fact that man in the hands of the law, to wit, in the grip of the forces of the state, even the strongest man, were he a very Hercules, is in a precisely as defenseless and helpless position relative to those in whose power he finds himself, as the weakest woman would be in the like case, neither more nor less. Again, I don't know how the left forgot this. This guy's a Marxist. I mean, I don't know. It's just like, wow. I don't know. I don't understand how these people got here. I mean, we've talked about this before. Part of the reason why we got here is that there was an active attempt to subvert the left. I think the socialism originally was a right-wing reaction to capital. I've done some videos on that. I think some pretty cogent arguments can be made in favor of that. So that being said, Ebel Bax is a very interesting and important antidote to this, because it's, we think of socialism and feminism as completely the same, or Marxism and feminism is completely the same. And while there were elements throughout history, it wasn't always this uniform, right? It was, there was some pushback. And so, let's see here. Let's see if I can find another interesting. Yes, this is another interesting point. Chapter 8, the indictment. And Ebel Bax says this: the whole movement is quite evident, depends for its success, largely, at least, on the apathy of men. The bulk of men undoubtedly do not sympathize with the pretensions of the feminist agitation. But the bulk of men are indifferent one way or the other. They do not take the feminist movement seriously. The bare notion of women as such, being a danger to men as such, strikes them as absurd. They do not realize that the question is not of physical strength, of women as women, but of the whole forces of the state being at the disposal of women to set in motion to gratify their whims and passions. The idea of a sex war in which women take the field against men, such as represents the inwardness of the whole feminist movement of today, seems to them ridiculous. The feeling at the root of most men's good-humored patronage of or indifference to modern feminist claims is roughly expressed in a remark of the late William Morris in replying to some animadversions of mine on the subject. What does it matter? A man who ought to be always able to deal with a woman if necessary. Why, I could tackle half a dozen women at once for that matter. This is a common attitude of mind on the subject among the otherwise sane and sensible men. The absurdity of it is manifest when one considers that the issue of man versus woman as units of physical strength, respectively, is purely irrelevant. It is not a question of the man tackling the woman or any number of women. It is the question of the whole force of the state tackling the man in favor of the woman. The prevalent idea in many men's minds seems to be that of the state drawing a ringed fence around the disputant man and woman and letting them fight the matter out between themselves, which is to speak the language of the great geometry of antiquity, is absurd. So what does this all mean? What's the point? Well, this actually highlights perfectly what I've been saying tonight. So there's two hierarchies Bax is talking about. Okay, the state over the rest of us, and then man over women. And as he points out, one is not like the other. One is not like the other, right? Even a Hercules is in the same position of weakness in the face of the state as a woman would be. And so what's really helpful about Bax's The Fraud of Feminism is that he understands the clear distinction between these two hierarchies, the natural hierarchy of men over women, and then the unnatural hierarchy, or at least excessive hierarchy of a total state. I mean, because I agree with Aristotle that in many regards, the political, which could lead to state formation, is an organic process. But there are limits. You know, I mean, Aristotle didn't dream of a world government, for example, right? But again, he's a Marxist, 1913. So at one point, they did understand that there are, quote, natural hierarchies and unnatural hierarchies. That's no longer the case is the result of many, many things. So I think that is all that we have for tonight. I've given everybody a lot to think on, and I hope this helps clarify quite a lot of problems that I've seen on both the right and the left with regards to equality. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.